Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Rabin. Our guest today is Steve Pereira. He's the co-author of a recently released book titled Flow Engineering, From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. His co-author, Andrew Davis, was a guest here recently, so check the show notes for a link to that episode. So before I tell you a little bit more about Steve, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Very happy to be here and talking to you again. Have a great time every time we talk.
Yeah, and the previous conversation, Steve and Andrew were guests together in a different podcast series that I run, Lean Blog Interviews. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. But again, we're joined by Steve Pereira. He spent over 2 decades improving the flow of work across organizations. He's worked through tech support, IT management, platform and infrastructure engineering, product management, and has also been a founding CTO, Chief Technology Officer, for an enterprise SaaS company. He serves as CEO of Visible Consulting, as COO to the Value Stream Management Consortium, chair of the OASIS VSM Interoperability Technical Committee. That's a mouthful.
It is.
Got through that. And co-founder of the Flow Collective to bring flow-focused professionals together. So I think we'll just jump right in. There's so much to talk about from the book Flow Engineering and different concepts that we love talking about here. But I'm going to ask the main question right away here, Steve. With the different things you've done in your career, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
This is I'm sure you find this with all your guests, but like it's such a tough question to sort of think about, all these stumbles and then try to rank them and be like, what is my favorite? And what is maybe the most, consequential or meaningful? And I think, personally, I come back to one thing that was kind of like a pivotal moment in my career as an individual contributor. And that's because it was, extremely painful and very much a breaking point in the way that I saw work. And, I was kind of in tech, and I've always been in tech because I speak publicly quite a bit now, but I'm naturally pretty introverted, pretty private person. I like to be working on my own wherever possible because I like to make my mistakes in private, or historically I have. Now I like to do it in public because I find it's much better that way. It's much easier to learn, and the sting actually gets lessened every single time. So that's a hack that I really embraced. But back when I was working as an individual contributor, this sense of value and the ignorance of value was really, I think, my Achilles heel. The fact that I assumed that I could be working on something valuable without having that validated and without having feedback and, a direct connection to a customer, whether that was external to the company or internal to the company, or even my, direct reporting manager, right? Like not thinking about how do I work backwards from what we're trying to do, and instead making a ton of assumptions about this is going in the right direction, and I'm doing this the right way, and this is what people will want. All that wasted an insane amount of time and just creates it exacerbates this sense of isolation and distance from meaning and feedback and the sense of going in the right direction, the sense of progress even. And, I kind of think about a specific instance where I was working prior to going into consulting, prior to starting as, CTO. This was like my last individual contributor role. And I was tasked with improving a developer workspace. So on every laptop, you sort of stand up the environment that allows you to make API calls and run services and kind of test a local version of whatever you're building. And, this is a very valuable problem to work on. It's very close to, my own interests as an individual contributor. Everybody likes to have their workspace just so and have it all work and enable productivity.
Mm-hmm.
But I was treating this entire effort as my own problem, right? As I was the customer, or as if I was the customer.
And there were how many other developers then for
this? Was an environment where we probably had about 50 developers across multiple different languages and tool sets and products. And so the task was kind of like, build us a repeatable, standardized, highly automated developer workspace, because whenever we would break something, or you had someone change teams, or a new tool came out, or we changed the version of a tool, you want it to be everywhere, so that people aren't building in different directions and you have these like conflicts over time. So very meaningful. And I felt the gravity of it. I felt very attached to it as an objective. But, this idea that I was the customer really removed me from all the valuable feedback that would inform every good decision I could make. And I could just spend my days working on this on my own, tumbling down rabbit holes, exploring all these what if scenarios, trying to basically build a gold-plated solution that was just becoming increasingly distant from what was actually needed, right? So if I had gone out and talked to a couple of these customers of mine and asked, what are the big pain points that are most important to you, and what really matters, what does good look like, all these things that we know as adults and as professionals to ask when we develop this sensitivity for the customer. I had none of that. And it took kind of building things that I would present to my leadership and say, well, it's not quite done yet. I don't really have much to show you. It's not where I want it to be. It's at some point it's going to do this. And, very much the kind of like terrible startup that never ships anything, right? That just like burns VC money and then ends up going out of business.
Because there's
me in a nutshell.
There's that trap of trying to make it perfect.
Exactly, and assuming what
I'm trying to remember who it was who said, if you're not a little bit embarrassed by what you're launching, it means you've waited too long. Or maybe 100%. A lot of people say that, right?
Yeah, I think that's part of lean startup.
Yeah,
or that that ecosystem. And this was before I really, this was after Lean Startup, but I hadn't read it. I hadn't really adopted that way of thinking. I hadn't been exposed to it. And I hadn't been exposed to this idea that even as an individual contributor, engineer, you need a deep understanding of customers. You always, no matter where you are in an organization, you need this deep understanding that there is always a customer. There's one right next to you, and then there's one on the other end, on the outside of the company, and everywhere in between, right? They're everywhere, and you always have to be delivering value. And the easiest way to do that is to find out, okay, well, what does value mean to you, customer? And let's work backwards from that. And so, I kind of really had enough rope to hang myself with under the circumstances. I had great leadership who would give me space, and they weren't hounding me for, when's it going to be done? What are the milestones? Give me a plan. All these things I would kind of mitigate that to an extent, but also, we work against things like psychological safety, work against, agile ways of working and knowledge work in general, where you could go away and figure out the problem on your lunch hour after weeks, and it could be worth it, right? You could really crack it open. And so that was another distance that I kind of took advantage of, or just squandered, basically. And then eventually it's like, this is taking too long. It's delivered not enough. Pull the plug, scrap it. And it was all kind of made worse by the fact that once I eventually started talking to these fellow developers and trying to really zero in on, okay, well, let's salvage this. What's the least we could get out?
Mm-hmm.
And, it turns out it was far less of a problem or value than we even anticipated, because all these engineers want their workspace set up exactly the way that they have it. And they don't really want to be pulling from other people and having it override what they've customized. They just don't want to be, out of a laptop for 4 days when they could be working.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is kind of a weird perverse incentive where if something breaks and it's someone else's problem, they get to go work on whatever, and they can go read a book for 2 minutes, And so all this really complicated the landscape and made this value calculation extremely complicated. But the only way to reconcile that and figure it out would have been to be with them, be as close to them, be as close to the problem and understand the problem. And I just jump right into solution, right?
Yeah.
Typical engineer, right into solution every time.
Yeah. And kind of assuming in a way you knew best, or you could figure it out. You had been tasked to do this. And maybe that mistake of assuming the way you wanted it would have been to everyone else's liking. And I mean, was that an impossible task to find something that, would it have been on average for everybody kind of horrible?
This is something that I've come to realize, is that more often than not, what you're getting is kind of the Abilene paradox implementation. And for anyone who's not, that's very esoteric. The Abilene paradox is basically like, we're all trying to go take a day trip, and everybody wants to go somewhere different. And then we end up going where nobody wants to go because it's the average of everybody's wishes, right? We end up going almost nowhere.
That's right.
So, but you can analogize that as just lowest common denominator, right? Which is often what people also don't care about and don't want. And so, if I really had leaned into this idea of the customer and developed some product management expertise, or at least enough to understand that, we probably have some segments of customers, we have some different needs, and maybe what's most valuable is to help the folks who struggle to go from 0 to 1, because that's a big challenge. And the folks who are trying to go from, 8 to 10, or, to perfect their situation, are less of a concern. And they're actually going to be very, very hard to please. The power user is always notoriously hard to please, right? So that would have also been a game changer, just to carve up the scope and say, this is not something we can win. There's extreme value here. And in the middle, we don't know, but once we tackle the easy low-hanging fruit, we can look in that direction and maybe there is value there. So just diving right into trying to make something work, you skip all that ability to really manage scope, manage expectations, develop the relationship with the customer, all these things. It's just a list a mile long things that should have happened.
Yeah. So how do you think, or when did these lessons become more clear to you? Obviously, there's been reflection that you've done. Was it sort of gradual, or as you got into that leadership role in that other startup, did you start to see connections to mistakes you were making individually, and thinking about that in terms of patterns of mistakes other organizations or leaders might make?
Well, I certainly didn't learn it immediately afterwards. It was something that I repeated a couple of different times in different scenarios. You always you always like to think that you're not making the same mistake twice, but you can make very similar mistakes as long as you're changing the context.
Mm-hmm. They seem different, but yeah.
Right, exactly. And you're not necessarily seeing the pattern. And so I think really when it landed for me was becoming a CTO and taking on that accountability of shepherding the entire technical organization of a team or of a company. And then there's a degree of customer connection to that. You're actually in the meetings with customers or prospects, selling, but you learn very quickly that the best way to do that and to be helpful is to listen. Mm-hmm. And to really get sensitive to pain points and the problem space and the circumstances and the context and the customer sense of value. And because, even in that scenario, I was learning every single time I was brought into one of these meetings where I would make an assumption and I'd come out of the meeting, or even in the meeting, I could see the eyes glaze over, or I'd come out and get feedback on, you really took this in a direction that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
And so it just gradually got beat out of me, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think, and I do tend to learn the hard way. So I don't think I was going to be getting it from a book or a course or anything. I kind of go to books when I have something that I want to learn more deeply, but I've developed a sense for it kind of viscerally, right? Like I've sort of run into it and then I'm like, okay, well, how do you really do this? Or how do you solve this problem officially? So it was a long road, and but I find that for me, I do have to make a lot of mistakes before something really sticks, and I see the patterns, and I, put all the pieces together.
Yeah. I want to go back, maybe dig a little deeper into something you said earlier. That was, you said, sharing mistakes publicly or making them in public view. You said the sting gets a little bit less painful every time, or something to that effect. Could you elaborate on that? And how has that helped you? Because that resonates with me, where I'll write blog posts about mistakes I've made, and I don't know, I'm getting off my chest, I'm processing it. Maybe it helps somebody else in different ways, but I agree with you that it becomes less painful. I don't dwell on it, whether I've blogged about it or not. Kind of think about it and move forward. What does that mean to you about that sting decreasing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was motivated by this kind of experience of failing in private and then having this kind of public reconciliation where, I'm making mistakes in private and they pile up, and then there's a big problem that I end up working out with somebody, and, that being extremely painful because it's the culmination of a bunch of mistakes. And then, there was something about what I recognized as a learning mechanism for me being setting myself an accountability target of saying, I'm going to give a talk at a meetup, or I'm going to present something to the company, or I'm going to write about this thing. And then working backwards from that obligation. And that was both a forcing function to get me to do it, which I found very, very helpful. And then that accountability of doing it in public was very powerful in not only, ensuring that I did my homework and I made sure that it was valuable to whoever I was serving through that effort. And then the idea that, would be out in front of them as quickly as possible and that reconciliation of value would be done before I got too far in any, wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really hit this sweet spot for me of making sure that I was setting targets and heading towards them and doing that in a way that I was for sure going to get it done. Like, I've never walked up on stage. I've never shown up for a podcast feeling like I needed to cancel because I was not ready to do it. And over time, that fear started out very acute, right? It was very painful to get up on stage. It was very painful to press publish. It was very painful to put that out there in front of people. But over time, that has actually become like a pleasant feeling. I don't know if people ever feel a pleasant feeling when they do a cold plunge, but I imagine that over time it becomes less painful.
Yeah.
For me, it's actually become pleasurable to do something like public speaking, because my brain is rewired from the fear to so many great things happen when I get a response, when I know that I'm, if I was in the wrong direction, I've been steered back in the right direction by someone who had the generosity to reach out to me and say, I've actually done work in this area and you might be interested in this. Very generous. Or sometimes it's just, this is wrong. You really should be doing it this way.
Yeah.
That, thankfully really doesn't happen. And I would say that, to anybody who's terrified of that prospect, it really doesn't happen. It's really what you find is a lot of generosity, a lot of people who are just excited that you are putting something out and very eager to support that, because we all love to hear people sharing things. I think this is a great thing about this podcast.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book. Again, the book is Flow Engineering, co-authored by Steve Pereira, joining us today, and Andrew Davis. First off, how would you define flow engineering to somebody who doesn't work in software development?
So flow engineering really is about solving flow problems. And when I say flow, I typically talk about workflow, but it's very closely related to the personal sense of flow that we feel when we're able to work kind of unencumbered at a suitable level of challenge, right? The Mihai Csikszentmihalyi sense of flow. But where I focus a lot of my attention is in collaborative workflow, people working together, and how do we. So the engineering part is really just alluding to the idea of solving problems, and problems with workflow being it takes forever to do things, it's too complicated. There's people working against each other inadvertently or not, and dependencies holding us back, all the things that we know get in the way of doing our best work, especially together.
Yeah. So delays, messed up handoffs. I mean, quality and flow kind of go hand in hand. Mistakes, bugs, defects, whatever words we might use, are a bigger interrupter to flow, whether that's on an assembly line and in a classic manufacturing environment, or in a healthcare workflow of getting medication from the pharmacy to the patient, or doing the work within a software company, whether it's coding or other functions in a software company. What are your thoughts there around kind of the impact of mistakes, or whatever word we might use, and flow? Because I think sometimes people think of speed and quality as somehow being trade-offs. I think lean manufacturing kind of helped break that notion that, they go hand in hand.
Yeah. I mean, there is kind of, one of the traditional manifestations of flow is like fluid dynamics, right? And we have laminar flow and we have turbulent flow. And laminar flow is basically when everything's flowing perfectly. And it's almost so perfect that you can't even see it happening because there's nothing that causes a disturbance. And what we can see are the disturbances, right? We can't really see when things are going perfectly, which is why we kind of, ignore things that are working well and we focus on things that are we think are going poorly. But the turbulent flow is essentially when you're hitting all these kinds of obstacles and objects in the way, or you have an imperfect channel for flow. And what happens is you get these little eddies, right, where the water actually turns back on itself and gets churned up. And as a result, the flow is decreased, right? Your ability to deliver is hampered. And so these kind of turbulent aspects, these little eddies, are commonly things like throwbacks or rework, right? Where, let's say I'm in stage 3 of a workflow, I expect to get something from my upstream handoff, whether that's directly or through a system, right? I take the piece of work, and let's say I'm in healthcare and I get a form and it's incomplete. That handoff goes back. It doesn't go forward; it goes backwards, and the clock is running the entire time. And so this lack of quality is impacting our throughput, our velocity, our lead time, our ability to get through the work and process the work that needs to be done. And we see this all over the place in knowledge work, and in highly mature manufacturing you probably see it a lot less, but in knowledge work, where it's a lot of developmental work, it's a lot of new innovation, things we're building things for the first time, that happens a lot because we don't really know what good looks like at any stage. And often it's the downstream handoff, the person who is receiving the work, that is the judge of whether it's good enough to go on, which means it gets passed back a lot unless we've created these standards of what does good look like prior to handoff. And so that's kind of a function of maturity. But when you don't have it, or it's just not worth it, or not, it's not reasonable for us to define the workflow in such strict, standardized terms, because we are trying to do different things all the time, right? So that's a real conflict. And I think it is this marriage of quality just enough to satisfy the goal, the customer, the mission, what we're trying to do, without painting ourselves into a corner or overly constraining the work product so that we squeeze all the innovation, all the discovery, all the novelty out of everything.
Yeah. One thing that you and Andrew wrote about, topic near and dear to my heart, comes up a lot in the podcast here, psychological safety. You mentioned that phrase earlier. What are some of your thoughts on how leaders can help foster or cultivate a culture where mistakes are seen as learning opportunities, that we can fail forward, if you will, rather than being something that's shameful or punishable? How do we frame things more constructively?
Yeah, there's a couple different dimensions to this, and I think that one that comes to mind is one that we often forget. We tend to, in places where we pay a lot of lip service to psychological safety, or we strongly believe in it, but we don't necessarily put it into practice, is when we say it's okay to fail and we want to fail fast. But one of the things that you'll hear about in these environments where fail fast is a talking point is that people ask, like, why can't we succeed fast? how are we doing on succeeding fast and our ratio of succeeding fast to failing fast? And those don't have to be 50-50, of course. But I think it's very important to close the loop on failure. And oftentimes, we fail, we acknowledge it, we have very healthy behaviors around making that less painful, let's say, and decoupling it from personal responsibility and personal accountability and direct negative consequences in favor of the performance of the overall system, let's say, or the health of the organization, and what we know good behaviors look like. But I think it's very important to actually leverage that learning into change, so that you don't have this kind of like failure debt. I've never used the term failure debt before. It might actually be a term of art that I'm misusing, but you can accumulate failure that you haven't translated into value if you're not acting on it, right? If it hasn't become, let's say, not impossible in the future, but far less likely because you've designed a mitigation or you've built something into your system of work that makes it extremely unlikely or mitigates the risk in some way, then I think the folks outside of that system rightly can criticize and scrutinize, what is the value of all this failure, and is this actually moving in the right direction,
Right.
or are we just stuck in a little vortex making the same mistakes over and over again?
Yeah. So that the phrase failure debt is really good one. And correct me if I'm wrong, but technical debt in a software company might refer to like a backlog of things that need to be done by development.
Technical debt,
bug fixes, or am I a little off on that?
Well, no, you're correct in that. In technical debt is in some cases. So technical debt is kind of the accumulation of compromises or suboptimal decisions, right? Things that you have to fix because, and people will often say that it's because we made the wrong decision. We're making short-term decisions. Sometimes you're making a very intentional trade-off, right? And it's more akin to sort of credit card debt, where you can use it to buy something frivolous, you can leave it on the card and have it rack up interest, or you can pay it off and build your credit score. There's a lot of different ways that you can leverage technical debt, some unintentional, some intentional. But I think failure debt is something similar that you could think of. What are we getting for our failures? How are we spending them, and how are we investing them into better ways of working, learning, and improvements to culture and all of these things? How do we see them as challenges to how we respond to failure, and how are we getting better at response and processing and being more generous and seeing things less in terms of individuals and more in terms of systems and causes and factors and ecosystems and all these things. You can go very broad with this, but I think that it's very important to challenge our response to failure and mistakes and be able to process it using the right model and the right mindset, and then being able to teach that as well is very important.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, it seems like there's more to technical debt or failure debt than just a simple backlog. It's the impact of choices. And I would think, firefighting probably leads to failure debt. So I'll use, think of a quick manufacturing example, a quick healthcare example. So there might be failure debt where, let's say, on an assembly line, team member grabs a part and it drops it. Well, they pull the andon cord. Team leader comes over. What's the problem? I dropped that part. They get handed another one. A replacement's ordered. The dropped part gets taken away. Now, let's say that keeps happening, right? So like putting the system back in place to keep the line running didn't really solve the problem of why is that part hard to grab? Is it slippery? Does it need to be redesigned? Does the worker need to wear gloves? Like, quote unquote, solving that same problem could be building up a cost of these parts that we keep scrapping at some interval. Or, I think in healthcare, I think the biggest cause of failure debt would be not reacting, not learning from the near miss failure. So like a nurse is about to give a medication and they notice at the last second, that's the wrong dose.
Right.
Are we just putting the fire out by sending that dose back to the pharmacy, getting the correct dose? And, there might be, we're busy, we're overloaded. We don't have time to work on root cause analysis. And then I think, well, nobody got hurt. We caught it. Good job. And then that failure debt could lead to something catastrophic of then, the wrong dose doesn't get caught and harms or kills a patient. Do those kind of sound like maybe failure debt?
Totally. I mean, those are great examples. Another one that came to mind for me is, we batch up a lot of our debt because we very seldom pull the end on court in knowledge work, and in a lot of complicated environments, we don't stop everything and swarm on a problem. And, we have things like retrospectives that might be at the end of an entire initiative, much less project, much less sprint. And so that reconciliation of the batch of all the things that went wrong accumulates before we can clear through it, but so does the distance from the occurrence, right? So the part of the debt is, how long ago did this happen, and do we actually remember the conditions that contributed to it?
Yeah.
And we're going to be able to try and forensically reconstruct the 5 whys or the Ishikawa diagram, or the thing that helps us understand why that happened and why it might continue to happen. The distance aspect of it, I think, is really interesting to think about as well.
I think it's the same reason to not batch up the opening of the literal suggestion box, physical suggestion box, or, God forbid, digitizing the suggestion box process doesn't really fix much of anything if it's being done in that batchy, let's have our monthly or, God forbid, quarterly improvement meeting. Everyone forgets what the circumstances were. It's harder to do that problem solving. So I'm going to call that, improvement debt, or to use the Japanese term, Kaizen debt.
That's great. And, another thing about the suggestion box, I think, brings to mind psychological safety as well, because in a lot of cases, you think about that scenario, you're anonymously dropping stuff in a suggestion box, you go and open the box every 6 months, nobody even remembers putting the thing in. Like, was that me? What does the handwriting look like?
And forensic analysis.
And the fact that you don't have an environment where people can personally approach someone and say, this I think could use some attention, or this is really holding something back. Being able to speak on behalf of others who might not speak up for any number of reasons, and have that all be acceptable engagement or conversation, I think is really, really important, and contributes to a lot of these things going unaddressed and piling up.
Yeah. So one last question for you, Steve, about the book, Flow Engineering. I know when you and Andrew were on the Lean podcast, we talked about how the book took a long time, and that's okay. I don't think that's a mistake. But I wanted to ask, was part of that process an opportunity? Did it take more time to define value and to work backward from what the reader needed? Like, did you, go and test early versions of the book? Or I'm just curious, like what you could apply from flow engineering and your own reflections to a book is, to me, like software.
And it really was in the case of flow engineering. I mean, there were total rewrites, total refactorings that happened. we changed things quite a bit. The beta version of Flow Engineering was actually an ebook that I wrote, I think back in 2018, maybe 2017. And it was really the collection of, not the complete program as it's delivered in the book, but it was, according to this idea of learning in public and delivering and getting feedback. I had this set of practices, put it out, and got a bunch of really good feedback on it. And then when Andrew and I got together and started writing the book, we initially tried to, do this as efficiently as possible, meaning we were both going to write one part of the book and then combine them together. And this is after a bunch of, we spent a lot of time collaborating on what was the vision for the book and what pieces needed to be put together. And then we went off and we wrote, and then we put that in front of our publisher as a proposal. And they said, well, you wrote 2 separate books. Congratulations, you have 2 books. And they were, separately, they were not good books because they didn't cover this, what was valuable to a customer, to a reader. They needed this combination. And what I think was uniquely valuable was really Andrew and I combining our perspectives as closely as possible. And that meant rewriting the book entirely to weave that thread together from the very beginning and keep that thread intact. And a lot of that was informed by the learning of working backwards, having a very, very strong sense of value. And that's all woven directly into the content of the book as well. It was kind of a wonderful experience to be able to use all of what we've learned in writing the book, but also integrate it into the actual copy of the book. And it's very much kind of a representation of what we've learned in our own journeys with trying to understand not only how to serve customers by starting from a sense of value, an understanding of value, and having that be collaborative rather than something that you come up with on your own, and then working backwards from that and trying to understand what's going to make that happen and what's in the way of making that happen. So it all seems very meta and interconnected, but that I find is what makes it extremely rewarding and drives a lot of satisfaction for me, because it very much encompasses the way that I see work and something that I see missing from work, that if I had the wherewithal to read it back when I made my favorite mistake, maybe I would have avoided it, or maybe I'd have to learn it the hard way anyways.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, Steve, thank you for sharing, your favorite mistake story and the reflections. And I think it sounds like one reason, even repeated, that it was a favorite mistake is that it did open your eyes to some different directions, and it sounds like led to this book, Flow Engineering: From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. So congratulations on the release of that book. And Steve Pereira has been our guest today, co-author on the book, Andrew Davis. You get to hear his story if you haven't already. So Steve, thanks so much for being here as a guest. Thanks for sharing your story and your insights today.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.